They say that a marriage is built on trust, but they don't tell you how easily that trust can be eroded by things you can't quite explain. For years, I thought Chloe and I had a solid marriage. Sure, we had our ups and downs. Who doesn't? But there was always a sense of partnership, of shared goals and mutual respect. That foundation made what came later even harder to believe. I'm Clyde, 36, a marketing director at a tech company. My wife, Chloe, is 33, a project manager for a construction firm. We've been married for 12 years and have 2 kids. Adam, 10, who's obsessed with soccer and superheroes, and Audrey, 5, who loves nothing more than coloring and building elaborate castles out of blocks. Life is busy, chaotic, and messy, but we've always managed to make it work. Or so I thought. It started with something small, as these things often do. Chloe's schedule had always been demanding, but recently, it felt like her work was taking over more of her time. She began leaving the house earlier in the morning and coming home later at night. At first, I didn't think much of it. She was in charge of a major project, and I knew how intense deadlines could be. But then the pattern started to emerge. Chloe began dressing differently for work. Sharper outfits, carefully chosen jewelry, even a new haircut that seemed out of character. When I commented on how great she looked, she'd smile and say it was just to boost her confidence for client meetings. It sounded reasonable, but something about the sudden change didn't sit right with me. Then there was the car. Chloe had always kept her car in pristine condition, but lately, I'd noticed an unusual amount of mileage on the odometer. I thought I was imagining it at first, but after a few weeks, I couldn't ignore the numbers creeping up. Her office was a 15-minute drive. So where was she going that was adding so many extra miles? I asked casually one evening, but she brushed it off, saying she'd been running errands for work. Her tone was light, but her explanation felt hollow. The first real crack appeared one weekend while I was cleaning the garage. Chloe was out with Audrey, and Adam was in the backyard practicing soccer. As I sorted through the clutter, I came across a crumpled paper tucked into the side pocket of Chloe's gym bag. It was a receipt from a cafe downtown, a place I knew wasn't anywhere near her office. The receipt was for 2 drinks and a slice of cake, dated a weekday, when she'd told me she was working through lunch to meet a deadline. I stared at the receipt for a long moment, my mind racing. It wasn't inherently damning. People grab coffee with colleagues all the time, but combined with everything else, it felt like a piece of a puzzle I didn't want to solve. Who was she with? And why hadn't she mentioned it? I tucked the receipt back into the bag and said nothing, though the weight of it lingered in my mind. Over the next few days, I started noticing more discrepancies. Chloe seemed distracted, her mind elsewhere even when we were sitting together. She used to hum while doing chores, her voice light and cheerful. But now the house felt quieter, heavier. Even her conversations with me felt different. Shorter, more guarded, like she was holding something back. The tipping point came one Friday evening. Chloe had told me she'd be working late again, so I decided to surprise her with dinner at her office. I figured it would be a nice gesture, a way to show her I appreciated how hard she was working. I stopped by her favorite sushi place, picked up a to-go order, and drove to her building. But when I got there, her car wasn't in the lot. I called her, but it went straight to voicemail. I waited for a while, thinking maybe she'd stepped out for a break, but she never showed. Finally, I drove home, the unease in my chest growing heavier with each passing mile. When she came through the door later that night, she looked startled to see me still awake. I asked how work had been, and she gave the same vague answer she always did, busy but good. I didn't press her, but my suspicions were now impossible to ignore. That night, as I lay awake staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The extra mileage on her car, the cafe receipt, the way she avoided my eyes when I asked about her day, it all pointed to something she wasn't telling me. I didn't want to believe it, but the signs were becoming harder to dismiss. The days following my discovery of the cafe receipt were weighed down by a quiet tension I couldn't ignore. Chloe's behavior became even harder to reconcile with the woman I thought I knew. She continued to leave the house earlier, come home later, and give vague answers when I asked about her day. Her energy was different too. There was a nervousness about her, a distracted edge that made her seem like she was always elsewhere, even when she was sitting right beside me. I decided to start paying closer attention. If Chloe was hiding something, I needed to know what it was before I confronted her. I began taking note of little things. The time she left, the excuses she gave, the patterns that didn't quite make sense. One thing stood out almost immediately: Elliot, her colleague. His name had started coming up more and more in our conversations, always in passing, as if she didn't want me to notice how often she mentioned him. Elliot suggested a new approach for the project. Elliot stayed late to help me organize the files. Elliot thought we should grab coffee to brainstorm ideas. It was always casual, always framed as work-related, but I couldn't help but feel like there was more to it. The way her voice softened when she said his name, the way she glanced away as if to gauge my reaction, it all felt deliberate, as though she was testing the waters, seeing if I was paying attention. I started to think about the cafe receipt. Was it Elliot she'd been with? And if so, what did that mean? My gut told me the answer, but I wasn't ready to face it just yet. Instead, I decided to dig deeper. That week, I started keeping track of her car's mileage again. Each day, I jotted down the numbers in a small notebook, noting how far she drove and comparing it to the route she'd take to work. It didn't take long for the discrepancies to become obvious. On several days, the miles didn't add up. She was going somewhere else, somewhere she wasn't telling me about. Then there was the laundry. Chloe had always been meticulous about keeping things clean and organized, but one evening, I noticed something strange. As I folded a pile of freshly washed clothes, I found a man's time mixed in with her blouses. It wasn't mine. I held it up, turning it over in my hands, my chest tightening as I tried to make sense of it. Was it Elliot's? And if so, how had it ended up in our laundry? I put the tie back where I'd found it, deciding to keep quiet for now. If I was going to confront Chloe, I needed more than just suspicion. I needed proof. The opportunity came sooner than I expected. That Friday, Chloe mentioned she'd be working late again, saying there was a deadline she couldn't miss. She didn't look me in the eye when she said it, and her tone was hurried, almost defensive. I nodded, pretending to accept her excuse, but inside, I was already planning my next move. After she left, I waited an hour before driving to her office. I parked across the street, far enough away that I wouldn't be noticed, and watched the building. Her car was there, parked in its usual spot, but the lights in her office were off. I waited, my heart pounding as the minutes ticked by, until finally she emerged. She wasn't alone. Elliot was with her. They walked together to his car, their heads close as they talked and laughed. I stayed in my car, watching as they got in and drove away, my mind racing. I followed them at a distance, careful not to get too close, until they pulled into the parking lot of a small restaurant on the other side of town. I parked nearby and watched as they went inside, their body language far too familiar for two colleagues grabbing a quick bite. I pulled out my phone and started taking photos. The way they leaned toward each other, the way she touched his arm as she laughed. It was all there, plain as day. I felt a strange mix of anger and relief as I documented everything, knowing that I finally had the proof I needed. I waited until they left, following them again as they drove to a nearby apartment complex. My chest tightened as I watched Chloe follow Elliot inside, her smile wide and carefree, as though she wasn't walking away from everything we'd built together. That night, I didn't sleep. The photos and mileage log sat in front of me like a puzzle I didn't want to finish. Every piece pointed to the same conclusion, and now there was no denying it. Chloe was cheating, and Elliot wasn't just a colleague. He was the reason for her late nights, her nervous energy, her lies. I wasn't ready to confront her yet, not without a plan. But I knew one thing for certain. The life I thought we had was over. The change in Chloe was becoming more noticeable with each passing week. Her late nights were no longer a rare occurrence. They were the norm. The weekends we used to spend together as a family had turned into quiet days where she was either working or too tired to join us. I could feel the distance growing between us. But what hurt the most was seeing how it was affecting Adam and Audrey. Adam, at 10 years old, is sharp. He doesn't miss much, even when you think he's too engrossed in his soccer games or superhero comics to notice what's happening around him. Audrey, being only 5, wasn't as aware, but even she could sense that something had shifted. It was in the way her bright energy dimmed when Chloe brushed off a request to play, or how she clung to me a little tighter at bedtime. asking why Mommy wasn't tucking her in anymore. One evening, after I'd come home from work, Adam was sitting at the kitchen table with his homework spread out in front of him. He looked up as I walked in, his brow furrowed. "Is Mom coming to dinner tonight?" he asked. I froze for a moment, caught off guard by the directness of his question. Chloe had texted earlier, saying she'd be working late again, something that had become an almost daily occurrence. I nodded, muttering something about her being busy, but the look on Adam's face told me he wasn't convinced. "She's always busy," he said quietly, turning back to his math worksheet. His words lingered in my mind for the rest of the evening. Dinner was quieter than usual, with Audrey picking at her food and Adam barely speaking. Chloe didn't come home until after the kids were in bed. Her usual excuse of meetings ran over, ringing hollow. I watched her as she poured herself a glass of wine, scrolling through her phone with a faint smile on her face. She didn't even ask how the kids' day had been. The following weekend, Chloe announced that she'd hired a nanny to help out during the evenings. "Just for a little while," she said, her tone casual, as if this was a perfectly normal thing to do. We'd never needed a nanny before. Our schedules had always worked well enough that one of us could be home with the kids. But now, with her late nights and constant meetings, it seemed like she was trying to offload more and more of her responsibilities. The nanny, a cheerful woman named Sarah, was great with the kids. Audrey adored her, and Adam seemed to tolerate her well enough. But their growing attachment to Sarah only highlighted how absent Chloe had become. Audrey started asking Sarah for help with her school projects instead of waiting for Chloe to come home. Adam stopped asking if she'd be at his soccer games, assuming the answer would be no. One evening, after Sarah had put the kids to bed, I found a drawing on the coffee table. Audrey had drawn a picture of our family, me, Adam, herself, and Sarah. Chloe wasn't in it. When I asked her about it the next morning, she just shrugged and said, "Mommy's always busy." It broke my heart. Adam, being older, started asking more pointed questions. "Why is Mom always gone?" he asked one night as we were sitting on the couch watching TV. "Doesn't she like being here anymore?" I tried to reassure him, telling him that Chloe was just busy with work and that things would get better soon. But even as I said the words, I didn't believe them. Chloe wasn't just busy. She was choosing to be elsewhere. The distance between her and the kids was becoming impossible to ignore. She rarely played with Audrey anymore, and when Adam excitedly showed her his latest soccer medal, she barely glanced at it before turning back to her phone. The kids were noticing her absence, and it was starting to hurt them in ways I couldn't fix. I started spending more time with them, trying to fill the void Chloe was leaving behind. We went to the park, baked cookies, and worked on homework together. But no matter how much I tried, I couldn't replace the presence of their mother. The questions kept coming, and the growing disappointment in their eyes only fueled my anger toward Chloe. It wasn't just the kids who were affected. The house felt emptier, colder. Chloe's once vibrant energy had been replaced by a kind of detachment, as though she was going through the motions without really being present. She barely looked at me when she spoke, her answers short and perfunctory. Her absence wasn't just physical, it was emotional too. I knew what was happening. I knew where she was, who she was with, and why she wasn't coming home. But watching it impact Adam and Audrey made it so much harder to keep quiet. Their world was starting to crack, and it was only a matter of time before it shattered completely. The tension in the house had become unbearable. Chloe's absence was no longer just a physical one. It was emotional, and it was affecting all of us. Watching Adam and Audrey try to fill the void she was leaving behind broke me in ways I didn't think were possible. I couldn't sit back any longer. One evening, as we sat together after the kids had gone to bed, I decided to remind her of what she seemed to be forgetting: her family. I kept my tone calm, avoiding confrontation. I told her how much I missed her, how much Adam and Audrey missed her. I talked about the little things, like how Adam kept asking why she wasn't at his games, or how Audrey had started drawing pictures that didn't include her. My words hung in the air, heavy with the truth I couldn't bring myself to say outright. Chloe's expression shifted as I spoke. For a moment, I thought I saw a guilt flicker in her eyes, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared. The next morning, she announced that she was taking the day off to spend with the kids. She framed it as a spontaneous decision, but I could tell she wanted to prove something, To herself, to me, or maybe just to ease her own guilt. Adam and Audrey were thrilled, their faces lighting up at the prospect of having their mom all to themselves for the day. They decided on a trip to the park, their favorite place to run wild and let their imaginations soar. I stayed behind, giving them space, but the unease in my chest didn't go away. Something about Chloe's sudden interest in family time felt performative, as though she were trying to make up for all the time she'd chosen work, or Elliot, over us. Hours passed, and when they finally returned, the kids burst through the door, their faces flushed with excitement. Audrey ran straight into my arms, babbling about the swings and the ice cream they'd had. Adam followed close behind, his words tumbling over each other as he recounted their adventures. And then he said it. Elliot was there too. The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. My chest tightened as I tried to process what he'd just said. I looked at Chloe, who had just stepped through the door. Her face went pale, her smile faltering as she froze in place. She opened her mouth, as if to say something, but no words came out. Adam continued, oblivious to the tension. Yeah, he helped push Audrey on the swings, and he and Mom got us ice cream. He's really funny. I couldn't move. My arms tightened around Audrey as I fought to keep my expression neutral, not wanting to alarm the kids. Chloe's eyes darted to mine, and for a split second, I saw panic, genuine, raw panic. She quickly plastered on a smile and tried to change the subject, asking Adam and Audrey if they wanted to help her unpack the picnic basket. I watched her carefully as she ushered the kids into the kitchen, her movements hurried, almost frantic. My mind raced with questions, each one more painful than the last. Why was Elliot at the park with them? Had this been planned, or was it a coincidence? And how long had he been a part of these family moments that I'd been excluded from? When the kids were out of earshot, Chloe avoided me entirely, busying herself with tidying up the remnants of their outing. She didn't meet my gaze, didn't say a word about what Adam had let slip. It was as if she were hoping I wouldn't bring it up, that I'd let it slide just like I had with all the other red flags. But I couldn't let it slide anymore. This wasn't just about me. It was about Adam and Audrey, about the lies she was weaving into the fabric of their lives. I had to stay calm, to bide my time and gather more evidence. But the weight of her betrayal was becoming impossible to ignore. That night, as Chloe tucked the kids into bed, I sat in the living room, staring at the photos and mileage logs I'd collected. Adam's words echoed in my mind, a cruel reminder of how deep this betrayal ran. Chloe wasn't just lying to me. She was dragging our kids into her lies, making them unwitting participants in her affair. After Adam's innocent confession about Elliot being at the park, I knew I couldn't wait any longer. Chloe's betrayal wasn't just affecting me. It was starting to seep into our kids' lives, tainting their sense of normalcy and trust. If she wasn't going to come clean, I needed to force the truth out into the open. And I needed proof. The next time Chloe said she had to work late, I decided to follow her. It wasn't a decision I made lightly. A part of me hoped I was wrong, that I'd find her at the office, diligently working on a project like she'd claimed. But my gut told me otherwise. The pieces of the puzzle, the cafe receipt, the unexplained Miles Adams story, were forming a picture I couldn't ignore. I waited an hour after she left, then grabbed my keys and drove toward her office. When I arrived, her car wasn't there. My stomach sank, though I wasn't surprised. I decided to drive past the restaurant where I'd seen her with Elliot before. Sure enough, her car was parked nearby, tucked neatly into a spot that felt too deliberate. I parked a few blocks away and waited, my hands gripping the steering wheel as I watched the restaurant's entrance. After about 20 minutes, they came out, Chloe and Elliot, laughing and leaning toward each other in a way that left no doubt about their connection. My chest tightened as I watched Elliot place a hand on the small of her back, guiding her toward his car. She didn't flinch, didn't pull away. She leaned into it, her smile wide and carefree. I pulled out my phone and started recording. The footage was clear. Chloe, laughing and smiling, her body language relaxed and intimate as she stood beside Elliot. I zoomed in, capturing every detail, every movement. When they got into his car and drove off, I followed at a safe distance, my heart pounding as I tried to stay calm. They pulled into the parking lot of a boutique hotel on the edge of town. My hands trembled as I watched them walk inside, their heads close as they whispered to each other. I recorded everything, the way they glanced around before entering, the way Chloe's hand brushed against Elliot's as they passed through the door. My chest felt tight, my breathing shallow, but I forced myself to stay focused. This wasn't the time for emotions. This was about gathering undeniable evidence. I waited in the car for over an hour, my thoughts racing as I replayed everything I'd seen. The betrayal wasn't just physical. It was in the way she smiled at him, the way she carried herself with an ease she hadn't shown at home in months. It wasn't just about me anymore. It was about Adam and Audrey, about the life she was jeopardizing without a second thought. When they finally emerged from the hotel, I hit record again. Chloe's hair was slightly tousled, her cheeks flushed as she walked beside Elliot, laughing softly at something he said. They shared a brief kiss before getting into his car and driving off. I stayed in the parking lot for a long time after they left, the weight of what I'd witnessed pressing down on me like a physical force. When I got home that night, Chloe was already there, sitting on the couch with her laptop open. She looked up as I walked in, her expression calm and unbothered, as if she hadn't just spent the evening with another man. I felt a wave of anger and heartbreak, but I didn't let it show. I couldn't, not yet. The next morning, I compiled all the evidence. The videos, the photos, the mileage logs, even screenshots of her text conversations with Elliot that I'd found on her tablet when she wasn't looking. It was all there, laid out in stark, undeniable detail. I sent everything to my lawyer, explaining the situation and asking for advice on the next steps. That day, as I watched Chloe play with Audrey in the living room, laughing and smiling like everything was normal, I felt a strange sense of calm. The storm was coming, and she had no idea. The morning I decided to leave was heavy with silence. Chloe was in the kitchen, humming softly as she made coffee, blissfully unaware of the storm about to descend. I watched her from the doorway, wondering how she could carry on so effortlessly, her betrayal tucked neatly out of sight. The weight of what I'd uncovered, what I now knew without a doubt, pressed against my chest like a boulder. I had already packed the kids' things the night before, careful to keep it quiet. Adam and Audrey were still asleep, their small bags tucked neatly in the trunk of my car. Everything was in place, the evidence I'd sent to my lawyer, the email drafts ready to go, the plan meticulously thought out. This wasn't a decision I'd made lightly, but there was no turning back. When Chloe left for work that morning, I put the plan into motion. I sat at the dining table, laptop open, and sent the email I'd written days earlier. It was concise, direct, and included all the evidence I collected. Videos of her with Elliot, screenshots of their messages, and detailed explanations of how long this had been going on. The recipients were carefully chosen. Her colleagues, her closest friends, even her family. People needed to know the truth about the lies she'd been living. As I hit send, a strange sense of relief washed over me. For months, I'd been carrying the weight of her betrayal alone, pretending everything was fine while the cracks in our marriage grew wider. Now, the burden was hers to bear. The lies she'd built her life around were about to come crashing down, and there was no escaping it. With that done, I woke the kids and told them we were going on an impromptu trip. Adam looked confused but excited, asking if Mom was coming with us. Audrey, still half asleep, simply nodded and held on her favorite stuffed animal. I smiled, keeping my tone light and cheerful, even as my chest ached at the thought of what this would mean for them. We drove for hours, the kids chattering in the back seat while I navigated the winding roads toward my parents' house. They didn't ask why we were going or why I'd packed so much. For now, it didn't matter. They were safe, and that was all I cared about. Back at home, Chloe's world was falling apart. My phone buzzed incessantly with messages and missed calls, but I ignored them. The few I read were exactly what I'd expected: shock, confusion, and anger from the people who had believed her lies. Her coworkers, the ones she'd charmed with stories of late-night meetings and endless deadlines, now had the proof of what she'd really been doing. Her closest friends, the ones who had always defended her, were silent. Even her parents, who had always adored her, now knew the truth. I imagined her walking into the office that morning, her usual confident stride faltering as the whispers began. The glances from her colleagues, the emails waiting in her inbox, the realization that everything she'd tried to hide was now out in the open. It must have hit her like a tidal wave. She'd built a world around deceit, and now it was crumbling beneath her feet. At my parents' house, I sat down with Adam and Audrey to explain what was happening. I kept it simple, telling them that we were going to stay with Grandma and Grandpa for a while. Adam's brow furrowed, and he asked if Mom would be joining us. I hesitated, then shook my head. "Not right now," I said, my voice steady. He didn't press further, but I could see the questions in his eyes. Audrey, too young to understand the gravity of the situation, seemed content to explore her new surroundings. She ran through the house, her laughter echoing down the halls, while Adam quietly unpacked his things in the room my parents had prepared for him. I watched them, a mixture of relief and sorrow settling over me. They deserved better than this. Better than Chloe's lies. Better than the cracks she'd allowed to grow into chasms. Later that evening, as the kids slept, I checked my phone for the first time in hours. Chloe had called over a dozen times, her messages ranging from frantic apologies to angry accusations. She'd seen the email. She knew what I'd done. And now, she was scrambling to pick up the pieces of the life she'd destroyed. One message stood out among the others. "Please, we need to talk. You didn't have to do this." I stared at the words, feeling nothing but cold detachment. She didn't understand. This wasn't about punishment or revenge. This was about truth. She'd lied to me, to our children, to everyone around her. And now, the facade was gone. For the first time in months, I slept soundly that night. The weight of her betrayal was no longer mine to carry. The truth was out, and the future, uncertain as it was, felt like a clean slate.